Have you ever looked back at your life and wondered, how in the hell did I become this person? Not because you're proud of who you've become, but because you honestly don't recognize yourself anymore. Somebody asked me a question recently. They said, "What's the hardest lesson you've ever learned?" And I answered without even thinking. The hardest lesson I ever learned was accepting that I was responsible for allowing people to treat me poorly. The second those words came out of my mouth, I knew people were going to misunderstand them. No, I'm not saying I was responsible for the way other people chose to treat me. That's on them. I'm talking about something a whole lot uglier than that. I'm talking about spending years trying to earn respect from people who had absolutely no intention of giving it. And the worst part is I didn't even realize I was doing it. You know what finally made me start asking that question? I started looking back at the younger version of myself. And honestly, if you knew me back then, you wouldn't believe I was the same person. In high school, I was a rebel. I spent more time suspended than I did sitting in any classes. People knew exactly who I was, and most of them liked me because I was wild. If somebody disrespected me, there was a pretty good chance somebody was getting punched in the mouth. And I'm not proud of that. Matter of fact, I've got scars all over my face to remind me every time I look in a mirror. Then my 20s came. I traded the schoolhouse for the bar room. I drank way too much, made a lot of stupid decisions, took more rides from the bar to the Gray Bar Hotel than I care to admit. Again, I'm not proud of any of that. But if I'm going to tell my story, I'm going to tell you the truth. Then one day I got sick of being that guy. Not because somebody forced me, because I looked at my own life and realized that I wasn't becoming the man that I wanted to be. So I quit drinking, started taking responsibility for my life, built a career, worked very hard, always showed up, always kept my word. And if I told somebody I was going to do something, I did it. Somebody needed help, I was there. I wanted to become the kind of man that people could depend on. And I did. Looking back, that's where everything started changing. Not all at once, not overnight, so slowly that I never even noticed it. The guy who used to explode over disrespect, he started swallowing it. The guy who would have knocked your teeth out for crossing a line started convincing himself that maybe it wasn't that big of a deal. And every single time somebody crossed another line, I could feel that old guy inside me. He never disappeared. I'd hear him, I'd feel him. And every time I'd tell myself, no, don't be that guy anymore. You're better than that. Just keep your mouth shut, keep the peace, win them over. I thought that's what maturity looked like. I thought that's what becoming a good man meant. What I didn't realize was I'd slowly started confusing self control with self abandonment. Those aren't the same thing. One is wisdom, the other is surrender. I couldn't see the difference. Because every time I chose silence, I told myself I was taking the high road. Every time I accepted something that I shouldn't have, I told myself I was being patient. Every time I ignored another red flag, I told myself I was giving somebody grace. I had an answer for everything. I could justify almost any behavior, not because I was blind, but because I wanted to believe everybody else was trying to become a better person too. I knew I was, so surely they were, right? But that was one of the biggest mistakes of my life. I judged other people by the standards I was trying to live by. And life has a way of teaching you that not everybody is climbing the same mountain you are. Some people are trying to become better. Some people are just looking for somebody better to use. I didn't know the difference. Not then. And that realization would end up changing everything. I wish I could tell you there was one moment where it all became obvious. There wasn't. That's what makes this so dangerous. Nobody walks into your life wearing a sign that says, I'm going to slowly teach you to accept less than you deserve. It happens one compromise at a time. One excuse, one more chance, one more time biting your tongue, one more time telling yourself that they didn't mean it. They're just under a lot of stress. They've got a lot going on. They'll come around. Make excuses for them. I became really good at explaining away things I should have been paying attention to. Not just in one relationship, in life, at work, with friends, with family, anywhere I wanted someone's approval. And that's the part that finally hit me. I kept asking myself, why did I let this happen? The answer wasn't because I was weak. The answer wasn't because I was afraid. The answer was a whole lot harder to admit than that. I wanted people to like me. That one sentence explains years of my life. I wanted people to think I was a good man. I wanted people to know they could depend on me. I wanted to be the guy everybody called when they needed something. And if I'm being completely honest, it felt good. It felt good to be needed. It felt good to be the dependable one. It felt good to hear, I don't know what I'd do without you. Until one day I realized most of those people weren't saying that because they appreciated me. They were saying it because I made their life easier. There's a difference, a big one. The people who genuinely loved me never expected me to abandon myself to keep them happy. The people who expected me to constantly sacrifice myself were usually the ones who disappeared the very minute I stopped. Think about that. The moment you finally say no, the people who only valued your usefulness suddenly have a problem with you. Why? Well, because you changed the deal. You stopped giving them unlimited access to your time, your energy, your peace, your life. And looking back at it, I don't think the biggest mistake I made was trusting the wrong people. I think the biggest mistake I made was believing I could earn their respect. You can't. You can't earn admiration. You can't, or you can earn admiration. I'm sorry. You can earn a reputation. You can earn a paycheck. But respect, people either choose to give it or they don't. And the people who don't will gladly take everything you're willing to hand them while giving almost nothing back. That's a hard truth. And another hard truth, the old guy inside me wasn't wrong about everything. He was wrong about using his fists. He wasn't wrong about recognizing disrespect. Somewhere along the way, I buried that instinct because I was terrified of becoming the man I used to be. So instead of overreacting, I underreacted. I went from one unhealthy extreme to another. I finally understand now that there was always a third option. You don't have to punch somebody in the mouth, but you also don't have to invite them to keep punching holes in your self-respect. You can simply remove their access to your life. No screaming, no revenge, no proving a point, just peace. And you know what's ironic? When I was young, people liked me because I was wild. Later, they liked me because I was dependable. Today, I honestly don't give a rat's ass if anybody likes me. Because I finally learned something I should have learned decades ago. The people worth having in your life don't require you to sacrifice yourself to earn a seat at their table. The ones who demand that price, they were never your people to begin with. So if somebody asked me today, what was the hardest lesson you've ever learned? My answer hasn't changed. The hardest lesson wasn't realizing that people can treat you poorly. Most of us already know that. The hardest lesson was accepting that every time I ignored what I knew, every time I excused what shouldn't be excused, every time I stayed quiet just to keep somebody else happy, I was helping build the very life that was making me miserable. That's a brutal thing to admit, but it's also one of the most freeing truths I've ever learned. Because the day I accepted responsibility for what I was willing to tolerate was the day I stopped waiting for other people to change and finally started changing myself. And looking back, I don't miss the fighter. I don't miss the drunk. I don't even miss the man who needed everybody's approval. What I like best is the man who's finally learned he doesn't need any of them to become who he was supposed to be. Y'all, that's my 2 cents for the day. I'll see you in the next one.